Well, thank you very much. Just if we go about acronyms, we have BEST. So just in case, exactly, this will be your best talk today. I don't know whether it's really the best, but it doesn't matter. Behavioral economics, society and technology is what we hide behind that. As Matthew said, we do a lot of work on behavioral economics, but there is this idea to look at behavioral and economic barriers to the uptake of innovations. And there you can see how this work on patents and the exchange of scientific information comes about, and where I need to stay still. That's difficult. Where these things come together. So there is a big work or one program in the BEST Center where we look at non-market interactions and we look at scientific collaborations, but there is this work on intellectual property and knowledge transfer as well. So what I want to do is, when Matt asked me, I will talk to a large extent to this paper that we published, I think a little bit more than a year ago in Nature Biotech on mapping more or less the non-patent literature, the scholarly literature and its impact on innovation. So it really takes this type of approach to how can we look at the scientific literature and understand what's the impact on commercialization. And I give you an idea of what's done there. This is done with a patent lens or the lens.org database. It was called the patent lens before. So this is actually housed at QUT. You can actually meet the engineers and some of the data people because they are here. It may be worthwhile to look into that. I give you a very short glimpse on what we do with the data there. It's worthwhile to have a look at their webpage. It's not yet targeted at an academic audience and academic researchers, but they're on the way to move in that direction. So that's really a data infrastructure that strongly focuses on more or less enabling researchers and inventors to navigate the landscape and more or less find out. Like I loved Eva's photos, how difficult it was when we needed to go through cards. Then it was slightly easier because we could look at many of them when we look at microfilm, and nowadays we can easily search and it pops up all this. It's more or less now a problem that we find too much information than finding something that matters at all, right? So that's a lot of the work that Richard Jefferson and the team behind the lens.org do, and I talk a little bit about 2 or 3 ideas of his, and then I give you even a quicker glimpse on 3 projects that we are currently doing here in the business school, partly based on that data. So that's us. I just talked about that before. Just as a quick idea and similar, like I thought there's not much new that I can say. For economists, when you come look at it, at a lot of the economics research on patents, we actually very often focus on patents as a measure of innovation. So economists love to do it with numbers, as they say, and we counted patents and more or less try to find out how innovative is a company, how innovative is a country, what's the effectiveness of different types of policy programs, and that's to a large extent what economists have done for a long time. When I started to talk with Richard Jefferson and the people at the Lens, I found it very interesting that he made this strong point, very similar to what Eva said earlier, that there is also this learning aspect, that this is knowledge, this is a different way to share scientific knowledge and new insights. And that there is this second part, that it is just not only this monopoly right to use an innovation and provide incentives for innovation, and therefore the reason why we can count patents as a scientific knowledge, but there is also the obligation to disclose information. So it's an exchange, right? You share information, for that you get these monopoly rights to use it and get economic benefits out of this innovation. And one of the questions that you could have then is, does that actually work on the patent system? Have we actually looked at that enough? I think for lawyers that seems to be much more the case than for economists. There's not much work of economists on whether disclosure is actually working. I think what I just heard in the talk before is this point that maybe we should be thinking more carefully what is the function of patents with respect to disclosure, right, to get the system working as well. So a very simple idea. I took a photo of the Odlet drawing. You see something not much, like I need a good designer. This is just a very quick thing to do. You could say for a lot of work, we like, especially if you look at scientometric works and how economists have looked at scholarly knowledge, we have only focused on published research, and we look a lot at citations, how more or less the scholarly research informs other scholarly research, right? And we know about rankings of universities that are just based on this left-hand side and more or less, you know, how research refers to other research in this space, right? And then we know, or you know in particular, that there exists this completely separate knowledge of a work of knowledge that's captured by the patent literature. And interesting enough, for a long time when you look at patents, you also had some sort of cross-site, like the citations from patents to other patents, and we somehow tried to identify how important patents are by, for example, how many citations they received, right? So the two scientometric literatures have more or less separated or were looked at in a separate way, and it was pretty hard to draw the connections to bring them together, right? What the lens did over the last, I would say, 5 years is try to draw both bodies of whatever research literature, bring them together, right? And there's more. Like this is very much simplified, right? You could just it's not just published research. There could be other types of knowledge. It's really very much just to keep it very simple. Now, if you think about who matters, to some extent, we had academic researchers, and for that reason, I think we had a lot of scientific knowledge. We sometimes have the funders in government, and they want to get this type of numbers to evaluate policies and make sure that we researchers work hard enough or whatever, have some sort of measures to control things. But you could also ask, what's the role for industry? And I think, again, the first two talks before talked a lot about how can we make that system work better, right? And what I find important, if we think about the questions, on the one hand, we like in all of this case, we try to handle a lot of information. You want to make sure that you find the right research, right? So how do we make sure, actually, and we have search engines, a lot of that has been addressed now. It's much easier to search both types of literatures. But we haven't yet really managed to make it easy to find partners, right? Some of the type of things that you would like to achieve, if you think about it as a researcher, it's sometimes very hard to find the industry partners if you want to take your research further, right? So how can we actually move in the direction to have this information that makes it easier to connect to the right people to move projects forward? And you could move on. It's not just finding partners in the sense of university and industry collaboration, could also be other resources, right? Skills and so on. How can we see from all of this body of literature who are actually the people where the match would be particularly good? So that was the reason why the lens moved in the direction to really map the academic literature and the patent literature, right? So that you can really see what are the papers that are cited in patents, and which other patents may cite that as well, because you may have one industry partner that you collaborate with, but it only goes so far. If other firms relate to the same articles, would this be other potential partners to take up on that? So that's the idea with that type of infrastructure in mind, and what the questions that the lens.org tries to answer. And I show you now more or less one application of what you could do with that, and it focuses in particular on this evaluating partners, potential partners, and research and programs in that space. So this is the paper from Nature Biotech, where we just look at more or less what are the relationships between the patent literature and the non-patent literature, right? And what I have drawn here is the share of patent families with references to citations in the non-patent literature, right? And how, like, you know more about patents and how citations come along. So a lot of that depends on the examination process, but it becomes relatively clear if you look across the different areas, in almost all relevant patent jurisdictions, the non-patent literature plays an important role in patents as well, right? So by just more or less looking only at patent data and not looking at these interactions between the two literatures, you miss part of the picture, right? And what we try to do in this first paper is to evaluate the role of different fields for patents. So this goes now back to the economics argument that we can use patents as a measure of innovative activities. And you could ask, what are the fields that matter in particular for commercializable innovation, right? And this is not rocket science. You would expect that the STEM fields are the ones that are the most important fields, right? So this is more or less just saying, well, if we do this type of exercise, does it actually work in an area where we know quite well what happens, right? But in principle, you could go much more, get into much more detail there and actually try to understand which parts in different types of fields of scientific endeavor have more or less of an impact on industry advancement, innovations that actually are realized in industry, right? So that's the first type of analysis. We go about how to actually work on that. What are the issues? How do you really identify, for example, different inventors? There's a lot of problems that it's difficult to tell people apart. If you know the discussion about ORCID, how do we identify researchers? There's a couple of challenges there. The paper discusses some of that aspects as well. You can go further and talk a little bit more about other work that we do here in a couple of minutes. But in that paper, we also look at how you could start to see how successful different funding programs are. So this is like in the paper we do an exercise on the UK Medical Research Council. So they had about 90,000 papers published that refer to funding over the last 10 years, and about 8,000 of those, so a little bit less than 10%, are actually cited in the patent literature, right? So you could start to look at how successful are different type of funding programs in the sense of the research that is actually published in academic literature. How successful is it in getting commercializable, like by businesses seen as valuable research out there? How does it turn into patents, right? What happens there? We can actually start then to look at what's the impact of different institutions on innovation, right? So we all know roughly, if you look at scientific literature, you think it's Harvard, MIT, Oxford. Well, we all have roughly an idea what would be the top 10 universities. What we did in this paper is, and I just give you a quick, I think the top 50 are in the original paper, but that wouldn't fit here. So we more or less used one way, and in the paper we present two different ways. The results are not too different. These are the top 10 universities in the world, or research institutions. If you look at the impact of their publications on patents, so citations from the patent literature to work allocated to these universities, right? And the interesting thing is, and that's what I like, well, MIT is still there, and you would expect that, right? Maybe you have heard of the Scripps Institute, and this is somehow normalizing for size, and it's a highly specialized one. You would get that maybe in a very specific one. But then you see that there are a couple of universities that you wouldn't expect necessarily in this top 10, right? So it's a different picture that you get if you start looking at this type of data. And there's no right or wrong, as with all types of maps, right? But it may be worthwhile to actually start looking at this information as well if you want to talk about what is the impact of different research institutions on their research. So what does this take me to? This is a cartoon that Richard loves, and he actually got it drawn up from the artist when you saw it in a slightly different form. So we are somehow on this idea that we hope that good science leads to benefit to society, but very often we are a little bit hand-waving in between, right? And that's what I heard a little bit in the talk before as well. How do we get that right? So there is this type of idea, and I talked of that before, that you want to actually provide a tool that actually helps people to bring together the parts of knowledge, right? How can we think about that? And this is another picture of the lens.org. It is really about this idea to bring together skills, know-how, but also the legal rights, the patents, the IP, but also the knowledge about how to organize the regulatory environment to make things work, right? How can we get all this information connected? That's a little bit the plan where the Lens hopes to go. And as I said, at the moment, it's a lot in patent law, in patents, but it now has the scientific literature, and they're working on trying to get the regulatory environment in a way that it actually speaks together and you can generate this type of pictures and move forward. Very quick on projects that we do, and Nancy is here as well. She works on the project I'm talking about. One of the ways that we actually started to answer this question, what are barriers to this teaching or learning function of, or the knowledge function of patents, is to actually somehow try to get a handle on disclosure. And what we did is we worked with computational linguists, and we just said, well, give us your biggest hammer, and we whack the patents with it. This is more or less a computational linguistic software that gives you 100 measures of readability. So whatever they have there, because we said we don't know what's the right way to go. I have to say the software already did have this, and they were very proud to have something that does everything that's currently state-of-the-art in linguistics. And we more or less said, well, we don't want to make the decision what's the right measure. We just use this instrument that gives us 100 measures, whatever, number of words in a sentence, to really some sort of much deeper constructs based on machine learning, where you look at how kids learn to read, and you can actually measure that in texts. And what you find, this is a study that then just says, well, maybe university patents and industry patents are different. Is the disclosure the same? Are universities, because they need to license, maybe much clearer than industry patents? And we actually find some sort of evidence for that in the linguistics, right? The linguistics is not a perfect measure for what's good disclosure in a patent, but we somehow try to get to this stage where economists like to do it with numbers, where we get numbers to actually make this type of analysis, right? We find some sort of evidence for that. So trying to study disclosure in patents is the first project. The second one is in line with what we have seen in the in the original paper in Nature Biotechnology, looking at evaluating different funding programs. Here we look at the ARC, and for the economist is really excited that the ARC has these programs, the discovery and the linkage scheme, where the difference is not much in the selection process, but just whether you need an industry partner or not, right? So why does government want to do that? Well, they hope that it leads to more industry relevant outcomes. How can we measure that with the patents? And we actually see that the targeted program, so that's the linkage program, actually leads to more patents. So we look here on an inventor level. So we count more or less inventors, researchers that have patents and grants. And we see of those, and there's a selection problem there, but you have to make a decision at one point in time. We see the targeted programs actually give you higher numbers of patents that follow from that research. We can also start to look at what's the optimal mix of those, and you find that you shouldn't be only using linkage funding, but you should have more than half of your research should be focused on or should be funded by linkage grants to have the best outcome. This is all looking at STEM projects only. So just in case you wonder about yourself, I can't tell you much about law academics, but the same is true for all the economists. I don't talk about myself. Last thing, and this is with colleagues in finance, where we try to start to understand whether diversified patent portfolios, what's the implication on product market behavior of firms. So there's interesting enough in the finance literature, a lot of research that shows if you have a diversified research portfolio, patent portfolio, it leads to market diversification. And there is a lot of research that goes exactly in the opposite direction, but the two don't talk to each other. What we do there is trying to bring both hypotheses together and actually allow to look at the data in a way that allows to keep both directions and more or less look at this in a dynamic sense. I won't go into detail on that because we can get really stuck into that. And I need to think always about it when I try to understand. It's maybe slightly difficult to be as dynamic as our data allows us to be now. And I think we should be all good. Thank you very much.